So once again, I'm talking about older work. This is not a new project, it's work that's been done a few years ago. And I think it follows on quite nicely from the last two presentations. As has just been said, in Australia we have gradual seasonal transitions, inadequate winter chill in a lot of areas, and Rebecca alluded to the future impact of climate change, and Heidi described that in a bit more depth. And the result of all this is that in a lot of regions, and particularly in some of the newer cultivars, we get poor and or non-synchronous bud break, usually resulting in quite an extended flowering period. So what's the problem with a non-synchronous bud break? Well, we end up with a wide range of different growth stages on the tree, particularly at flowering time. So we can have buds still at even at tight cluster stage right through to petal fall in some cultivars. And this, of course, leads to very unpredictable responses to our thinning chemicals, particularly if we're trying to use desiccating chemicals, but also with the hormonal type thinners. And it leads to a lack of uniformity of fruit maturity, resulting in multiple picks. And this obviously has an impact on orchard profitability. So we can use chemicals to manipulate dormancy, and these are used to reduce the chilling requirement. They modulate the timing of bud break and flowering and fruit maturity if they're used correctly. There are a large range of chemicals that have been used as rest breakers or dormancy breakers, and I've just put a few up there. In Australia, Dormex or hydrogen cyanamide is probably the most commonly used one. One of the newer dormancy breaking chemicals is Waken, which is a mix of fatty acids, and this was developed specifically to try and solve the problem of dormancy. So what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides is just some of the studies that we've done in Tasmania and Victoria again on a range of chemicals, Dormex, Waken and Armour Break. And we've looked at them on a range of cultivars: Fuji, Gala, Granny Smith, Pink Lady and Sundowner. So if we have a look at the impact of Dormex, here we see that oops, wrong one. If we apply Dormex 40 days before estimated bud burst, we see quite an significant advance in bud burst. The black bars are bud burst. The green bars are full bloom. So we get about a 10-day advance in bud burst and about an 8-day advance in full bloom. Applied at 30 days before estimated bud burst, we still see a significant advance in bud burst and a slight advance in full bloom. At 20 days before bud burst, we don't really see any effect in bud burst. This is compared to untreated controls, and a very slight retardation of flowering. And the closer that we get to bud burst, so 10 days, and this is at bud burst, the greater the retardation of bud burst and flowering. So Dormex can be quite a powerful tool depending on what we want to do with our bud burst and our flowering. So here, this is the days from pink bud through to full bloom. Here's our untreated control. So at 40 days before bud burst, we've actually compressed the flowering period, and again, the closer we get to bud burst, the more extended the flowering period becomes. We also saw an effect on crop load. We had quite a marked reduction in crop load at 40 days before bud burst. All these trees, including control, had standard chemical thinning program. So because we'd compressed the flowering period, this is one reason that we can see such a marked improvement in crop load control. Again, the closer we get to 20 days, the less effect. At 20 days, as you can see here, if we go back to here, we had no effect on flowering. So That's reflected here, and the closer again we get to bud burst, the greater the reduction, and this is due to bud damage. So if we have a look at this bottom graph, we can actually see if we're applying Dormex at bud burst, we're getting up to 20% death of buds, which is pretty significant. Okay, looking at Waken, if we look at concentration of Waken, here's our control. The higher the concentration, the later the flowering becomes. And this graph, this actually shows that we get compression of the flowering period. So here again, we've got our 3 different concentrations of Waken. So we've got quite an extended flowering period in our controls and much shorter flowering period in our Waken treated. Moving on to the Pink Lady, percentage of flowers open. Again, this was just with one rate, 4% Waken. Again, we can see a marked compression in flowering and the same effect in the Sundowner. And the interesting thing in the Sundowner, the brown bars Waken was applied at green tip, and the green bars Waken was applied as late as the finger stage. We still saw an effect on flowering and bud break with green tip application, but nothing at finger stage. And there was some initial damage to the buds with the late applications of Waken, but all the buds grew out of it and there was no permanent damage, unlike we saw in the Dormex. This is the comparison of Waken and Armour Break in Fuji apple. And as you can see, very little difference between the 2 chemicals. They were both applied late August. Trees were still just dormant. And they both compressed flowering period in this particular trial from 36 days down to 16 days. So they actually halved the flowering period, which is quite significant. If we combine Waken with a thinning program, here's the effect on crop load that we get with Waken. So we do have some effect, very similar to the effect on ATS. When we combine the 2, we're getting within our target range. So these dotted lines here represent our target range for Fuji. So it is definitely beneficial for our thinning programs. So our key findings. Dormex is an effective chemical, but it is extremely toxic. It's not just phytotoxic, it also has health effects for the applicator. We must apply it while the trees are dormant. The closer to bud break that we get, the greater the level of phytotoxicity. Waken is a much safer chemical all round. We can apply it later in the season, right up to green tip. The recommendations that we came up with from the work was around 6 weeks before anticipated full bloom, but the label says otherwise, but that's fine, it still works. But there are still some questions arising. We haven't done a direct comparison between Dormex and Waken, so we don't know the relative merits of each when you compare them directly. We need to clarify the impact on thinning programs with a whole range of chemicals and have a look at the effect on fruit maturity. So where do we go to from here? Well, as part of a project variation put up by Heidi under project AP 12029, we're actually going to look at, in 3 different sites, we're going to look at a direct comparison between Dormex and Waken on one cultivar. And the objectives of this little project are to look at the efficacy of both Waken and Dormex for inducing earlier flowering and for concentrating the flowering period. We're also going to look at the use of these dormancy sprays in relation to cost effectiveness. Do we get a more concentrated flowering period which results in a need for fewer sprays such as for western flower thrips and dimpling bugs? And is the efficiency of blossom thinning likely to be improved? Are Waken and Dormex equally effective? And also to look at the impact of the chemicals on fruit set, yield, variability of maturity at harvest, and the length of harvest as well. Okay, so that's it.